a man decided to plant two different futures in his garden. In the south patch he scattered seeds for quick lettuce, and in the center he buried a single heavy acorn from a majestic oak. Within 3 days, the south patch was a vibrant carpeted green. The lettuce sprouts were reaching for the sun, visible to anyone passing by. The man felt a surge of pride. He could see his progress, measure it with a ruler, and envision the harvest. But the center of his garden remained a patch of dry, brown dirt. A week passed, then 2. The lettuce was already being harvested and eaten, yet the spot where the oak was planted showed no signs of life. It looked like a graveyard. Frustration began to gnaw at the man. He stood over the barren patch with a shovel, convinced that the seed was a dud, or perhaps insects had eaten it. He was seconds away from digging it up to see what was wrong. What he couldn't see was the violent, invisible war happening beneath the surface. While the lettuce was busy growing 2 inches of leaf, the oak was spending every ounce of its energy pushing a massive taproot 3 feet into the earth. It wasn't interested in the sun yet, it was interested in the bedrock. It was building a plumbing system and an anchor that could support tons of timber for the next 200 years. The latency wasn't a delay, it was a structural necessity. The man almost killed the greatest asset he would ever own because he tried to measure the growth of a giant by the timeline of a weed. He realized that the most significant things in life often look like a failure in the beginning because they are busy building a foundation that the surface cannot yet see. The sower was a man of immense work ethic. He woke up before dawn, strapped a heavy bag of premium grain to his shoulder, and walked into the fields with a rhythmic, powerful swing. He threw his seeds everywhere with equal intensity. Some fell on the hard-packed dirt of the roadside, where the birds followed his footsteps and ate the profit before it even touched the ground. Some fell into patches of rocky soil where the sun was hot. The seeds sprouted fast, but because there was no depth, they withered into straw by noon. Others fell into thickets of thorns that grew twice as fast as the grain, choking the life out of his work until only pale, useless stalks remained. By the end of the season, the sower was physically broken. He had used the best seeds and worked more hours than anyone in the village, yet his granary was nearly empty. He sat on a stone and looked at the one small corner of his land, the deep, dark, tilled soil, where the harvest was so thick he could barely walk through it. He looked at his calloused hands and realized a bitter truth: 90% of his sweat had been a waste of time. He had been trying to work hard to overcome the physics of the environment. No amount of effort could make a rock grow grain, and no amount of sincerity could stop a bird from eating a seed on a public road. His failure wasn't a lack of character, it was a lack of auditing. He realized that the most important work isn't the sowing, but the selection of the ground. In a low-yield system, your effort is just fuel for a fire that produces no heat. A wealthy investor went on a long journey and entrusted his capital to 3 managers. To the first, he gave 5 talents of gold, to the second, 2, and to the third, 1. The first 2 managers immediately went into the marketplace. They faced the noise, the volatility, and the risk of the trade. They bought, they sold, and they doubled the gold through the friction of movement. But the third manager was a man of extreme caution. He looked at his single gold coin and saw only the possibility of losing it. He imagined the master's anger if the coin disappeared in a bad deal. He wanted to be safe. He took the coin, polished it until it shone like a mirror, wrapped it in a clean cloth and buried it deep in the earth where no thief could find it and no market could touch it. When the master returned, the first 2 managers presented their gains and were given more responsibility. The third man dug up his hole, unwrapped the cloth, and proudly handed back the original coin. "Look," he said, "I have kept it perfectly safe. Not a scratch on it." He expected a reward for his faithfulness. Instead, the master was furious. He called the man wicked and lazy, and took the coin away. The man was shocked. He hadn't stolen anything. But he failed to realize that in a living, moving world, standing still is a form of decay. By protecting the gold from the market, he had stripped it of its only purpose: growth. He realized too late that the greatest risk in life isn't losing what you have. It's the certainty of having nothing more because you were too afraid to let the gold do its work. In the heat of a communal kitchen, a baker stood before a massive stone basin filled with 50 pounds of heavy, dense flour. It was a cold, inert mountain of white powder, lifeless and static. To transform this mass into enough bread to feed a village, An amateur might think it required hours of violent pounding, pulling, and external force to stretch the dough. But the master baker didn't use his muscles. He reached into a small ceramic jar and pulled out a piece of fermented leaven no larger than a man's fingernail. It looked insignificant, almost pathetic, compared to the sheer volume of the flour. He tucked it deep into the center of the damp dough and walked away. While the kitchen grew quiet, the leaven began its silent work. It didn't pull the dough, it converted it. It began a microscopic chain reaction, one cell feeding on the sugars, releasing gases, and passing the energy to the next cell. The change was internal and self-replicating. By the next morning, the heavy, dead mass had become a living, breathing entity. It had doubled and tripled in size, spilling over the edges of the basin. The baker hadn't added more flour, and he hadn't used a machine to pump air into the bread. He had simply introduced a living logic that was more powerful than the weight of the dough. He realized that true scale is never achieved by adding more bulk. It is achieved by finding the one active ingredient that changes the nature of everything it touches. The secret wasn't in the quantity of the effort, but in the exponential nature of the catalyst. At harvest time, 3 farmers stood at the edge of 3 adjacent plots. They had all bought the exact same premium grain from the same merchant, and the spring rains had fallen equally on every inch of their soil. To an outsider, their potential was identical. But as the scythes began to move, a strange discrepancy appeared. The first farmer's field yielded 30 bags of grain for every bag he had sown. He was satisfied. It was a respectable return, enough to cover his costs and live comfortably. The second farmer, however, brought in 60 bags. He had spent his evenings walking the rows, identifying the specific pests that targeted his stalks. But the third farmer's field was a wall of gold so thick it seemed to hum with energy. His yield was 100-fold. When the others looked at his soil, they realized he hadn't just farmed, he had engineered a masterpiece. While the others were resting, he was hand-pulling the smallest weeds that stole the nitrogen from the roots. He had dug narrow, precise irrigation channels that ensured no drop of water sat stagnant or evaporated in the sun. He treated every square inch of the field as a high-performance system. The difference in their wealth wasn't found in the seed. The seed was capable of 100-fold from the start. The limit was found in the management. The 30-fold farmer was limited by his general approach. The 100-fold farmer was limited only by the biological capacity of the earth itself. He realized that growth has a natural ceiling, but most people never hit it because their system is too leaky to hold the full power of the harvest. The extra 40% of his profit wasn't luck. It was the mathematical result of eliminating the friction that his neighbors ignored. The old fisherman had spent years dreaming of the Great Haul, the kind of catch that legends are made of. He had spent decades in the same bay, pulling in just enough to survive, always waiting for the day the ocean would finally open its hands. One moonless night, it happened. He felt a vibration in the hull of his boat, a deep, rhythmic thrumming of thousands of fins. He cast his net, and the water began to boil with silver. It was a mass of fish so dense it looked like solid metal. His heart hammered against his ribs as he began to haul the line. This was it, the wealth that would change his life, his children's lives, and the fate of his village. But as the weight increased, a terrifying sound rose from the depths, a sharp, staccato snap. His net was old. The hemp fibers were frayed from years of good enough maintenance. He had always meant to reinforce the mesh, to double knot the junctions, but he was always too busy chasing the next small catch. Now, as he tried to drag the impossible fortune toward the surface, the tension reached a breaking point. A single strand gave way, then 10, then 100. The net didn't just leak, it disintegrated. The massive weight of the fish acted like a lead weight, dragging the remains of his net into the deep. He stood in his boat, gasping for air, watching the silver cloud vanish. He was left with nothing, no fish, and now, no net to catch tomorrow's meal. He realized that the blessing of growth had become a curse, because he had focused on the catch while neglecting the container. The ocean had provided the opportunity, but his own infrastructure had committed suicide. He learned too late that if your capacity doesn't grow faster than your ambition, the very thing you prayed for will be the thing that destroys your livelihood. At the edge of a vast, dusty plain, the crowd stood before a crossroads. To the right was the wide road, a beautiful paved highway that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was lined with merchants, comfortable rest stops, and thousands of people walking in high spirits, carrying massive trunks of luggage. It was the road of consensus, the path where everyone agreed success was waiting. The travelers laughed and sang, certain that the sheer number of people on the path was proof of its validity. But at the very end of the horizon, the road began to narrow into a massive, tangled bottleneck where millions were now trapped in a stationary, shouting mass, unable to move forward or back. To the left was the narrow gate. It was a jagged, vertical crack in a mountain wall, so thin that a man could barely fit through sideways. There was no paved road leading to it, only a rocky, steep trail. A few travelers stood at its base, looking up with grim expressions. They realized that to pass through, they had to leave everything behind. One man looked at his heavy chest of gold and realized it wouldn't fit. He left it. Another looked at his fine, bulky robes and stripped down to a simple tunic. Every step was a calculation of, what can I live without? Those who chose the narrow gate were ridiculed by the crowd on the highway. Why suffer? They shouted. The easy road is right here. But once the travelers squeezed through the final, suffocating gap of the rock, the world opened up. On the other side was a high plateau of untouched resources, vast green valleys, and a sky that felt infinite. There was no competition here, no noise and no bottlenecks. The few who had endured the theft of their luggage now found they had the entire world to themselves. They looked back at the mountain wall and realized the gate wasn't narrow to be cruel, it was narrow to filter out the heavy. The barrier wasn't the rock, it was the unwillingness of the crowd to let go of the extra. They understood that the greatest growth is always hidden behind a door that most people are too loaded down to enter.